Hi, I'm Murphy Griffin.
I'm Madison Taylor.
And welcome to episode 5 of Neophyte Boat Rights. In this episode, we're going to start lofting the Newfoundland Trap Skiff, as well as show you how to loft a boat yourself.
Now, lofting is a lengthy and complicated process, and we don't want to gloss over anything, so we'll be splitting the concept into multiple videos. We've already done a couple introductory videos on lofting, and we'll be using the knowledge we learned there in this video to loft the grid work and the profile outline, as well as give you some boat anatomy and theory.
So, let's get to it.
So a few notes before we begin. Not everybody has enough space to draw the 3 different perspectives of the lines drawing separately, the half breadth, the profile, and the body plan. So instead, they superimpose them on one lofting board like we've done. This has a few advantages. For one, everything's consolidated, so you save on space. Also, you only have to draw the grid work for one lofting board. And also, when you go to manipulate some of the measurements of different perspectives, you don't have to run back and forth between different boards. You've got them all in one place.
So boat plans generally come in one of 2 flavors. Either they're drawn to the inside of the planking or the outside of the planking. The plans for the Newfoundland Trap Skiff are drawn to the inside of the planking, so that's the procedure that we'll be showing you here. For plans that are drawn to the outside of the planking, there are a few different tweaks that you have to make, but it's more or less the same. But nonetheless, all lofting starts in the same place, and that's drawing the grid work.
Diggy-diggy-dum-dum, diggy-diggy-dum. Diggy-diggy-dum-dum, diggy-diggy-dum, diggy-diggy-dum-dum, diggy-diggy-dum, diggy-diggy-dum-dum, diggy-diggy-dum, diggy-diggy-dum-dum.
The first lines that you're going to make on your lofting board are reference grid work lines. And the very first line that you make is what's called the baseline or the datum line. A lot of the measurements that are in the table of offsets are referenced off of this baseline, and so it's one of the most important lines. This needs to be a really long, straight line at the base of your lofting board. In order to make a long, straight line, what we did is we put nails at either end, drew a string across it very taut, and made little methodical marks along the line with a straight edge. After that, we connected all the dots, and we had a baseline.
আজব শহর দুনিয়ার কলকাতাতে ঘর আমার আজব শহর দুনিয়ার কলকাতাতে ঘর কবে আসবে শহর দুনিয়া কবে আসবে ঘর আমার আসবে আমার ছোট ঘরে.
So the next thing we're going to be doing is drawing the perpendicular lines for the grid work of our lofting. It's really important that they're actually perpendicular to the baseline. Of course, we want them to be straight, but they need to also be at a right angle to the baseline, because if they're not perfect, what will happen is that those little discrepancies can create issues throughout the rest of the lofting. So we need to find a way to make sure that it's actually perpendicular. What we'll be using is a tried and true medieval method where we'll actually be just using geometry, so no math, no equations or anything like that, to make sure that it's a perpendicular line. Now, a lot of people would think, why couldn't you just use something like a carpenter square? And while you certainly could try, even the small discrepancies in how square this is could end up being a problem. Maybe it's not perfectly square. And what happens is that the further you go down, that little discrepancy can turn into a bigger one and a bigger one, and it's going to create a lot of issues. And also, they're often just not big enough. With this method, we'll be able to create a perpendicular line as long as we want. We will start off by finding the point where you want to make your line. And so let's say we wanted to make it right there. And then you can just use a compass, and you can set it to whatever length you'd like. It really doesn't matter, but generally the wider the better, because it will make the points easier to find. And so what you do is you get a sturdy placement on it, and you're going to make a mark, just like that. And then you turn it around, taking special care to make sure that nothing changes or moves. Take special care to make sure that your point stays exactly where it was, so that these lines will be equidistant. All right, and now that you've got those, we'll be using a trammel. And you can put these on any size piece of wood, which is great because lofting can often be really large. So you can take these off, put them on a bigger piece. So what we'll do is take the trammel, put the point on one of the marks we've made. And when you go to draw your first curve, you want to do so generally about above where you think the perpendicular is going to be. So you'll make another marking here. You can make it fairly long so that we can find the point afterwards. And then you go to your second marking, place the point. And make your mark. Now this point should be a perfect perpendicular line from your baseline. And then all you have to do after that is take a straight edge and then draw your perpendicular line. So following this procedure, you should have not only a straight line, but a line that's perpendicular to the baseline at 90 degrees.
We essentially used a scaled up version of this procedure to loft the station perpendiculars as well as the forward and aft perpendiculars. First, while we knew that the station perpendiculars were separated 3 feet apart, we didn't know how far the forward and aft perpendiculars were supposed to be, so we had to go to the plans and scale up those measurements. Once we had those measurements, we could plot both the station perpendicular distances as well as the forward and aft perpendicular distances onto the baseline. With all those points plotted on the baseline, we could then use the very same procedure we just showed you to draw in all the perpendiculars. Finally, using the exact same procedure, we were able to draw in the buttock perpendiculars that will be used in the body plan view. So, with all these lines lofted, we've completed the vertical part of the grid work.
So now we're going to be drawing the horizontal lines of the grid. It's very important that they're equal distant from each other and straight all the way down. The best tool to use for this is what's called a tick stick. This is ours from the lofting we made, and it's really used just to make the whole process faster, easier, and to eliminate errors. So you'll start by drawing the points where you know the horizontal lines are going to be, and this is different for every boat. For our purposes, here for this demonstration, we're just going to be drawing them 3 inches apart. So now that we've got the markings for our horizontal lines, it's really important that you get in the habit immediately of notating pretty much everything. The lofting board is really big and it can get very complex very quickly, and you can easily lose track of what markings are what. So we'll go ahead and notate these as waterline 3, waterline 6, waterline 9, waterline 12. One of the main uses of the tick stick is just making the whole job easier. Instead of making those measurements down each perpendicular line, we'll be transferring the first measurements we made to the tick stick and then using that to go down the perpendicular lines. So if we take our tick stick like this, the first and most important thing you want to do is establish where your baseline is going to be on the tick stick, because you'll be using that baseline marking for every measurement you make afterward with the stick. So we'll draw our baseline right here. And then we can go ahead and transfer our horizontal line markings. Okay, now that we've transferred the measurements to our tick stick, again, really important to notate. So we've got our baseline, waterline 3, waterline 6, waterline 9 and waterline 12.
So one approach would be just to take the measurements each time on each perpendicular line for where you know your horizontal lines are going to be. The problem with that is that every time you make a measurement, you have the opportunity to introduce a little bit of error. And each time a little bit of error is introduced, it's going to throw everything out of whack. So even if a tiny bit of error was introduced when we transferred to the tick stick, it will be the same tiny bit of error every time we go down the line, which is better than a bunch of different ones.
So line up your baseline. And make your markings. And then of course, notate them.
So now it's time to actually draw the horizontal lines by connecting all the dots and points that you've made.
What you'll do is take a straight edge and just connect them. As you move down the lofting board, drawing your lines, it's really important that you overlap a little bit so that you can make sure that the lines aren't jointed and that you're connecting all of them equally down the lofting board.
Let's do it. So one of the common misconceptions about the grid work is that it's like this big piece of graph paper that you're just drawing the lofting on top of. But the grid lines are really important. They're actually representations of the curved lines that you see in the lines drawing, but seen in a different perspective. So for instance, if we look at waterline 6 here, you can see that in the half breadth perspective, it's curved. But if we look at that same waterline in the body plan perspective, you can see that that waterline is actually a straight line. So this is waterline 6, but seen in the body plan perspective. You can play the same game with all the other waterlines. So waterline 9 is curved here. It's the next grid line, horizontal grid line here. Waterline 12 is curved, and so again, another grid line. And so this whole horizontal grid work that you see in the body plan view is actually the curved water lines that you see in the half breadth view. It's not just a grid work that's there for reference. Those lines represent the curved lines that you see in the half breadth perspective. So this same thing is happening all across the lofting board. You have curved lines in one perspective that actually are straight in another perspective. So again, here in our profile view, we have the buttock lines that are nice sweeping lines. But if we look at them in the body plan view, they're actually vertical straight lines. So these are your buttock lines. They are not just a passive grid work. They represent the buttock lines in the body plan perspective. You see this again with the station lines. Now from the body plan view, you have the curved station lines. These curved station lines, seen in either the half breadth perspective or the profile perspective, are straight lines. And you can see that they actually, in the lines drawing, span all the way across the drawing. Curved lines in one perspective are straight in another perspective. This is an integral concept, one that you really have to master in order to understand what you're looking at in a lines drawing and on the lofting. So just a quick recap of the basic lofting process. Remember, there's something called a table of offsets. This table of offsets consists of a set of coordinate points. Those coordinate points are plotted on a grid work. Nails are then driven in next to those plotted points, and a batten is strung across those nails to get you the nice curved line. That curved line is traced onto the board, and voila, you have a lofted line. Now it's time to get down to business. We start by lofting the profile outline of the boat. This is the shear line, the stem line, the rabbet line, and the transom line. The lofting of the shear line is rather straightforward. Other than the termination points at the forward and aft perpendiculars, all the other points are given in a table of offsets, so they can be plotted on your grid work and connected together with a nice long batten. It's wise to use a batten that's 3 to 4 feet longer than the line that you're lofting, and for the shear line it's good to use a nice thick one since it's such a gentle curve. The next item of business was to loft the stem outline. None of these points were given to us in the table of offsets, so we had to figure them out ourselves from the lines drawing. What we did was measure the distances off the forward perpendicular along each horizontal grid line and figured out the coordinates of the forefoot. Once we had these coordinates, we could plot all these points on the grid work and connect them together with a smaller batten, one that was better suited to the tighter curve of the stem line. Okay, so the next thing that we're going to be lofting is what's called the rabbet line. And this is a very special line and it requires a little bit more explanation. We need to talk a little boat anatomy really quick. So what I have here is half of what we call a vertical keel. And what you can see here is that if this is the top of the keel and this is the bottom of the keel, this has a V-shaped notch carved out of it. Now generally the keel would run the length of the boat, and this notch would also run all the way down the length of the keel and also follow up the stem of the boat. This notch is what we call a rabbet or a rebate. So the rebate or the rabbet have 3 special lines that specify its shape. These 3 lines are the bearding line, the rabbet line, and what is often called the back rabbet. So the rabbet, this V-shaped groove, is actually a nice little niche for the planking to rest into. So the planking is wrapping around the boat and it needs to settle in somewhere. And the function of the rabbet is a place for the planking to rest. So if this is the planking, you can see that the edge of the planking terminates at the rabbet line. So in traditional boat building, there are 2 common types of keels, a vertical keel and a plank keel. This prototype here, this prop, is half of a vertical keel. But what we're building is called a plank keel. And it's different from a vertical keel in that the bottom part of the vertical keel is not present in a plank keel. That's all lopped away, and all that's left is the trapezoidal top here. So let's show you how that works. Okay, so with the bottom portion of the vertical keel cut away, you can see what a plank keel would look like. In this case, the planking rests against the bevel here, like so. The portion of the planking that's sticking below the bevel of the plank keel is browsed off.
So by cutting off that corner of the plank, the back rabbet line and the rabbet line merge. This is an important feature of the plank keel.
As for the rabbet line on a plank keel, it's not as significant as the rabbet line on a vertical keel, because as you can see, the rabbet line actually tells you where the bottom of the keel is. So when we plot our rabbet line, it's actually going to tell us where the bottom of the boat is.
So let's get to it. The rabbet line, much like the stem line, was not provided in the table of offsets, so we had to lift all of those measurements off of the lines drawing ourselves. So after figuring out all the gridwork coordinates as well as the aftward termination point, we were able to loft the rabbet line following the standard procedure. You'll notice that we're using a much thicker batten for the rabbet line, and we're using it on its side. This is because the rabbet line's mostly straight and we needed a nice stiff batten. After lofting the rabbet line, we could turn to the profile view of the transom line, which is pretty straightforward since it's just a straight line. So that completes the profile outline. There's still a whole lot more to loft. We've got to loft the water lines, the station lines, the buttock lines, as well as other construction details like the transom and the stem. But that's all stuff to look ahead to.
So that's the beginning of the lofting process. We'll be finishing up the lofting of the Newfoundland Trap Skiff in the next episode and releasing that relatively shortly, so keep your eyes peeled.
And if y'all are enjoying the project and want to show your support, don't forget to like, follow, and subscribe. And please consider becoming a patron on Patreon. We're really counting on patrons and donors to help keep the project alive. And on that note, we've got 2 new patrons for this episode.
Much thanks to Willem Zipe
and Vera Mills.
Thanks, y'all.
Bye.
Bye.